The day Harlan Prescott rode back into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, every man, woman, and child in Sumner County stopped what they were doing and watched him pass, because every single one of them owed him something they could never repay. The sun was already mean by mid-morning, hammering the packed dirt of Main Street into a pale, cracked clay that puffed up in small clouds around his horse's hooves. Harlan rode a big gray gelding named Cobalt, and he rode him easy, the way a man rides when he is too tired to sit up straight but too proud to slouch. His hat was the color of old tobacco, battered at the brim, and his duster had seen 3 hard winters and 1 very bad summer. He was 32 years old, lean through the jaw, wide through the shoulders, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of the same red sandstone that lined the creek beds south of town. Not handsome in any delicate way, but striking in a way you could not easily forget, like a hawk circling against a white sky. Men stepped off the boardwalk to give him a nod. Women touched their bonnets. The blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Clyde Harbor, actually set down his hammer when Harlan rode by, which was something no one had ever seen Clyde do for anything short of a fire. This was what it meant to be Harlan Prescott. 4 years ago, in the brutal summer of 1875, a drought had settled over Sumner County like a stone pressed flat against the earth. The wells went shallow, the creek slowed to a crawl, and then the Doyle gang had come through and taken what little the ranchers had left, burning 2 homesteads south of town, running off cattle, and leaving a widow with 3 children who had nothing but a scorched foundation and the clothes they wore. Harlan had ridden after the Doyle gang alone. He had brought back the cattle. He had brought back the widow's mule and her wagon. He had brought back grain from the Doyle camp that the gang had stolen from 4 different farms. And when Hector Doyle himself had tried to put a bullet in Harlan's back out on the open flats, Harlan had disarmed him and hauled him to the county sheriff in a single long, ugly ride, 50 miles in the blazing sun, with a man cursing him the whole way. He had never asked a single soul for a dime in return. Before that, he had lent his land to the Cutter family when their own place flooded in the spring of 1873. Before that, he had helped dig the irrigation trench that saved the East Side farms through the summer of 1872. Before that, he had paid the doctor's bill for the Renko boy who had been kicked by a horse and whose parents could not have paid it in 10 years of hard work. The list went back further than most people could track, and people in Caldwell had long memories for kindness. So they watched him ride in that April morning with the kind of reverence that made Harlan deeply uncomfortable, because he had not done any of it for reverence. He had done it because it needed doing, and he was capable of doing it, and he was not the sort of man who could look away from a thing that needed doing. He tied Cobalt to the post outside the general store and went inside to order flour and salt and 2 boxes of ammunition, and he was standing at the counter with his hat in his hands when the door opened behind him and let in a slice of hard spring light, and with it came Dorothy Bancroft. He had heard about her, naturally. You could not live within 20 miles of Caldwell without hearing about her. She had arrived 8 months ago from St. Louis, a widow, 28 years old, with a deed to a 40-acre parcel east of town that had belonged to her late husband's uncle, a man named George Bancroft who had died without heirs and left the property in a knot of legal confusion that had taken her nearly a year to untangle from Missouri. She had untangled it herself, without a lawyer, through a sustained correspondence with the county land office that the clerk, a methodical man named Otis Webb, had described as the most politely relentless series of letters he had ever received in his professional life. She had arrived in August with 1 trunk, 1 good horse, and a list of supplies that had impressed the general store owner, Frank Dodds, because it was practical to the point of being almost beautiful in its efficiency. She had asked no one for help. She had hired 2 men for the initial repairs to the farmhouse and paid them in cash on the day the work was done. She had introduced herself to her neighbors with a jar of preserved peaches and a firm handshake. She had planted a winter garden, kept a small flock of chickens, and managed the 40 acres with the kind of quiet competence that made people respect her immediately, even when they were not entirely sure what to make of her. And she had, 6 weeks after arriving, sat down with Frank Dodds and paid in full the debt that her late husband's uncle, George Bancroft, had been carrying on the store's credit ledger for 4 years. $37.60 in exact coin, which she counted out on the counter with the same composure she apparently brought to everything. Frank had tried to refuse it. He had told her that George was gone, that the debt was old, and that she had no obligation. She had told him, very politely and very firmly, that she had the obligation because the name was now hers to carry, and she intended to carry it clean. Frank Dodds had told that story to approximately everyone he knew within a week. Harlan had heard it, filed it away as one of those pieces of information that seemed important without his being able to explain why, and had not thought much more about it until this moment, when Dorothy Bancroft walked into the general store, and he turned to see who had come in. She was not what he had expected, though he had not precisely known what he expected. She was medium height, dark-haired under a practical gray bonnet, with a face that was intelligent and serious, and when she looked up and her eyes met his, immediately and disconcertingly direct. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the dim interior of the store, and they held his for exactly the length of time necessary to acknowledge that they had made eye contact, and then she looked at Frank Dodds and smiled and said, "Good morning, Frank. I need 2 pounds of cornmeal and whatever you have in the way of dried apples." Her voice was clear and unhurried, with a Missouri lilt that had not quite been weathered out of it yet, and it made Harlan aware that he was still standing with his hat in his hands like a man who had forgotten what he was doing. Frank said, "Morning, Dorothy, and I believe you know Harlan Prescott." She looked at Harlan again, and there was something in her expression that was careful and composed and slightly wary, the way a person looks when they have heard a great deal about someone and are forming their own opinion in real time. "I do not know him personally," she said, "but I know his name." "Everyone does," Frank said, cheerfully, already turning to the shelves. Harlan put his hat back on, which he immediately realized was wrong because he was still indoors, and then took it off again. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, "I have heard a good deal about you." "I imagine you have," she said, without any false modesty or unease. "And I have heard a great deal about you, Mr. Prescott. More than I can verify, some of it. Most of it is probably exaggerated," he said. "The part about the Doyle gang. Some of that, too." She looked at him for a moment longer, and something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile but the possibility of one. "Frank told me you brought back a mule and a wagon in addition to the cattle," she said. "The widow needed the mule more than the cattle, honestly." "That is the part that is not exaggerated then," she said, and turned back to Frank, who was setting her cornmeal on the counter with the expression of a man who was thoroughly enjoying himself. Harlan paid for his supplies, loaded them into his saddlebag, and stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he untied Cobalt and rode toward his property south of town. He was not entirely sure what had happened in the last 10 minutes, but something had shifted in the usual arrangement of his days in a way he could not yet measure or name. His ranch was 400 acres of good grass and hard work, a 2-room house that he had expanded twice over the years, a solid barn, a root cellar, and a bunkhouse where 2 hands, a quiet older man named Amos Tate and a young Texan named Billy Crane, kept their gear. The cattle were healthy, the fences were in order, and the creek that ran along the south edge of the property had held its water through the past 2 dry seasons, which meant he was better positioned than most. He was not a wealthy man by any measure that would mean anything back east, but out here, in the real arithmetic of the frontier, he was comfortable and stable in ways that many of his neighbors were not. He told himself that he was not thinking about Dorothy Bancroft as he rode home, which was why he was thinking about her constantly. He thought about the story Frank had told him, about the $37.60 paid out in exact coin for a debt that was not strictly hers to honor. He thought about the way she had said the name was hers to carry, and she intended to carry it clean. He thought about her direct eyes and her unhurried voice, and the fact that she had apparently, according to Frank, read the county land regulations carefully enough to identify a procedural error that had been holding up her deed, a detail that Harlan had filed away with the same sense that it was important, and he did not yet know why. He was not a man who was given to romantic thoughts, or at least he had told himself that for long enough that he mostly believed it. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Clara Whitmore, back in 1873, but Clara had gone back to Ohio with her family when her father's health failed, and Harlan had stayed because Caldwell was his place and he could not be anywhere else. The parting had been sad but clean, with no bitterness on either side, and Harlan had settled back into his work with the same steady persistence that characterized everything he did. 6 years later, he was used to his solitude in the way you get used to a scar, not quite comfortable with it, but familiar enough that it no longer surprised him. He did not know that Dorothy Bancroft was standing at her kitchen window that same evening, looking out at the darkening flat land east of Caldwell, thinking about a man with a battered hat who had put it on, and then taken it off again in the space of 4 seconds, and seemed genuinely surprised by his own uncertainty. She was, in her own private assessment of herself, a practical woman. She had been married to Edmund Bancroft for 3 years before his death from typhoid in the winter of 1877, and the marriage had been a decent and affectionate arrangement between two people who respected each other, though it had never been a great love story, and she knew that. Edmund had been kind and steady and not particularly imaginative, and Dorothy had been grateful for him and genuinely grieved his loss, but she had also recognized, in the long, quiet months of her widowhood in St. Louis, that she was capable of more life than she had been living. Coming west had been her own decision, made with clear eyes and a full understanding of what she was walking into, and she did not regret it for a single moment. What she had not expected, in her clear-eyed assessment of the West, was Harlan Prescott, or the peculiar effect of meeting someone who occupied the world in such a different way from any person she had previously known. The second time they met was 2 weeks later, at the community meeting held at the Caldwell Church Hall to discuss the new water rights ordinance that the county was trying to push through. The ordinance would have rerouted the main creek allocation in ways that would have disadvantaged the smaller farms along the eastern edge of the county, including Dorothy's parcel. She had read the ordinance carefully, as she read everything carefully, and she had come to the meeting with notes. Harlan was already there when she arrived, sitting in the 3rd row with Amos Tate beside him, listening to the county commissioner, a florid man named Garrett, explain the benefits of the new arrangement. Several ranchers were nodding. Several of the smaller farmers were looking at their hands. Dorothy sat down 2 rows behind Harlan and opened her notes. When Commissioner Garrett finished and asked for questions, 3 men asked about implementation timelines and 1 asked about compensation structures, and then Dorothy stood up. She was the only woman to speak, and the room noticed. Commissioner Garrett noticed too, with the specific kind of notice that translated into a slightly patronizing smile. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, "it is lovely to have you here." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "I have a question about Section 4. Paragraph 3 of the proposed ordinance, which states that reallocation will be based on acreage values recorded prior to 1875. My property was not recorded in 1875 because the deed dispute was not resolved until 1878. Under this language, my parcel would receive no allocation at all, not a reduced allocation, but none. I would like to understand whether this was intentional or an oversight." There was a silence in the room that had several different textures in it. Commissioner Garrett's smile became something less certain. 2 of the nodding ranchers stopped nodding. "Well now," Garrett said, "I am sure we can look into the specific circumstances of. "I have the relevant sections here," Dorothy said, and held up her notes with the calm precision of someone who has anticipated exactly this response. "I would also note that the Cutter property and the Renko property have similar recording gaps for similar reasons, and both would be affected in the same way. I am raising the question not only on my own behalf." The room went quieter. People turned to look at the Cutter family and the Renko family, who were both present, and who were both looking at Dorothy with expressions that mixed surprise with gratitude. Harlan had turned around in his seat to look at her. He did not say anything. He just looked at her with an expression that she would later think about more carefully than she wanted to admit, because it was the expression of someone recognizing something they had not expected to find. Commissioner Garrett spent the rest of the meeting backpedaling, and the ordinance was tabled for revision. Several people spoke to Dorothy afterward with warm thanks. The Cutter father, a big quiet man named Samuel, shook her hand twice. She accepted all of it with the same composed grace she brought to everything. Harlan found her outside by the hitching post, checking the cinch on her saddle. "That was well done," he said. She glanced at him. "It needed doing," she said, and then smiled slightly because she heard the echo of what Frank had told her about him. "I imagine you understand that feeling." He stood with his hands in his coat pockets for a moment, looking at her. The evening was cool and the stars were beginning to show at the rim of the sky. The church hall behind them was still alive with voices. "I heard you paid old George's debt at Dodd's store," he said. It came out more direct than he had intended. She did not look away or look uncomfortable. "Yes," she said, "you did not have to." "I know," she said. "The name was mine to carry." He looked at her for a moment in the half-dark, and something moved in his expression that he was not quite fast enough to put away. "That is a particular way of thinking about it," he said. "Is it unusual?" "Around here it is," he said. "Most people who inherit a debt find ways to walk away from it." She finished checking the cinch and straightened to face him fully. "Most people who inherit a neighbor's trouble also find ways to walk away from it," she said. "And yet here you are." It was said without any sharpness, entirely without accusation, as a simple observation, and it landed on him like something warm and unexpected. He was not sure precisely what to do with it. "Can I see you home?" he said, and immediately felt the question hang in the air between them with more weight than he had planned. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. "I know the road," she said, "but I would not object to company." They rode east out of Caldwell side by side in the cooling spring night, talking about water rights and county law, which should not have been a romantic conversation and was, somehow, entirely one. Dorothy knew the relevant Kansas statutes with a precision that made Harlan ask her twice where she had learned them, and she told him that she had spent the better part of the winter reading everything in the county clerk's office that Otis Webb would allow her to take home, which had been considerable because Otis Webb was a man who deeply appreciated anyone who treated legal documents with care. "You read ordinances for recreation," Harlan said, not as a criticism. "I read everything for recreation," she said, "but ordinances specifically because ignorance of them is costly in ways I prefer to avoid." "And you paid George Bancroft's debt at Dodd's store, and you stood up at a county meeting for the Cutter and Renko families," he said, "but you do not seem to particularly need anything from anyone." "Everyone needs things," she said. "I just prefer to keep the accounts clean." He turned that over in his mind. They were riding along the creek road now, the dark flat land opening out around them, the smell of new grass and water in the cool air, and Harlan was aware of being unusually awake to everything, the sound of the horses, the texture of the dark sky, the particular cadence of her voice. "And the debt at the store was $37.60, he said. "Exactly," she said. "You counted it out in coin. Frank told you that." Frank told everyone that. She was quiet for a moment. "It seemed important to count it exactly," she said, "not to round it. The debt was $37.60, and that is what George owed, and that is what I paid." "Most people would have rounded down," Harlan said. "I know," she said simply. They reached the edge of her property and the lane that turned off toward her farmhouse, and they both stopped their horses without quite deciding to, the way you stop when you are not ready for something to end. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Thank you for the conversation," he said. She smiled at him in the dark, the first real, full smile he had seen from her, and it changed the geometry of her face in a way that caught him entirely off guard. "Good night, Mr. Prescott," she said. "Harlan," he said, "if it is all the same to you." She considered this with the same deliberateness she seemed to bring to everything. "Good night, Harlan," she said. He rode home with the cool air on his face, and the stars thick overhead, and the settled sense that something in his life had just altered its course. The following weeks moved the way spring weeks do in Kansas, fast and full of work. The kind of work that fills your days so completely that you do not have time to examine your own thoughts, and yet the thoughts accumulate anyway in the margins of tired evenings and early mornings. Harlan found himself riding the east fence more than strictly necessary, because the east fence ran along the road that passed Dorothy's parcel, and twice he stopped to see if she needed anything and found her working in her kitchen garden with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and both times they talked for longer than the stopping had warranted. He learned that she had been born in Cincinnati but raised mostly in St. Louis from age 12, after her father, a schoolteacher, moved the family west. He learned that she had 3 younger brothers, all back in Missouri, who wrote to her every month and worried about her in ways she found endearing and slightly unnecessary. He learned that she read considerably, had opinions about Reconstruction and the rights of freed people that were more clearly stated than most people's in Sumner County, and that she made a preserves from wild plums that she claimed was better than anything she had tasted in St. Louis, which was a strong claim and which Harlan, when she handed him a jar of it one afternoon in early May, was forced to concede was entirely accurate. He also learned gradually, through conversations and observations, the texture of her daily life, and it struck him with increasing force that she was managing everything alone with a steadiness that earned his profound respect, and also, if he was honest, his concern. 40 acres was not a small property for a single woman. The farmhouse needed its roof repaired before the summer storms came. Her well was shallow, and the water table in that part of the county was unpredictable. She had 1 good horse and 1 mule she had bought locally in September, and the mule had a tendency to balk at the harrow that made the spring planting slower than it needed to be. He mentioned the roof one afternoon in mid-May, trying to be casual about it. She looked at him with her direct eyes and told him she was planning to repair it herself in June. He told her that shingle work on a pitched roof was not a one-person job. She told him that she was aware of that. He offered his help. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was beginning to learn, the one that weighed things carefully before responding. "I can pay you for your time," she said. The word pay hit him like a splash of cold water, and not in a bad way. It was so specifically her, so entirely consistent with the woman who counted out $37.60 in exact coin, that it made something in his chest do a complicated thing he was not sure he had vocabulary for. "I would not take money for it," he said. "Then it would be an uneven arrangement," she said, "and I do not like uneven arrangements." He considered this. "What if you made dinner?" he said, "and invited Amos and Billy because they would help too, and they are men who appreciate a good meal." She thought about this with visible deliberateness. "I can do that," she said finally. "It is even." And it was, or at least it was the kind of evenness that Dorothy Bancroft found livable, which was not perfect symmetry, but rather a careful accounting of what was given and received. Harlan was beginning to understand that this was a deeply important feature of her character, not pride exactly, and not coldness, but something more specific and more interesting. She had come to a place where everyone knew Harlan Prescott's name as a shorthand for a debt of gratitude, where the whole county leaned on him in ways large and small, and she alone had walked into Frank Dodd's store and paid George Bancroft's old account in full and said that the name was hers to carry clean, and she seemed to apply that same principle to every exchange in her life. She did not want to be in debt, not financially, not socially, not personally. She wanted to know that what she had was hers, earned and paid for, and belonging to no one but herself. Harlan, who had spent the better part of a decade doing things for people who could never repay him, and who had never wanted repayment, found this utterly confounding and utterly compelling in equal measure. The roof repair happened on a Saturday in late May. Harlan brought Amos and Billy and all the necessary shingles and tools, and Dorothy made a breakfast that was ready when they arrived at first light: biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee and eggs. And then she went up on the roof herself while the men were still finishing their coffee, because she had clearly decided that if she was going to accept help, she was going to be part of the labor. Billy started to say something about that, and Harlan gave him a look, and Billy went back to his coffee. By noon, the roof was half done and Dorothy had come down to start dinner, and Harlan paused at the ridge and looked out over her 40 acres in the hard May sun, and felt a complicated wave of something he did not entirely examine, but which had to do with the farmhouse below him and the woman in it, and the particular way the spring light moved across the flat eastern land. She had made a beef stew that was substantially better than anything that got made at Harlan's table, which relied heavily on Amos's limited but sturdy approach to food, and they ate at the table in her kitchen, which was a clean and organized and surprisingly personal space, with 2 books on the windowsill and a letter in progress on the small writing desk in the corner, and dried herbs hanging from a rafter hook. Billy ate 2 full bowls and looked genuinely grateful. Amos ate his 1 bowl with the methodical appreciation of a man who knew good food when he encountered it. "You are a fine cook, Mrs. Bancroft," Amos said, which was about the longest sentence Amos ever said to anyone outside of necessary ranch business. "Thank you, Amos," she said, and refilled his coffee without being asked, which earned her Amos's lifelong good opinion, as Harlan could see immediately. After dinner, the roof was finished by late afternoon. Dorothy paid Amos and Billy each $1, which they tried to refuse, and which she pressed on them with the quiet firmness of someone who is not going to argue about it. She walked Harlan to the gate when the others had headed down the road, and the late afternoon light was long and golden across the grass, and the whole place looked particularly good in it. "It is well done," she said, looking at the repaired roof. "It will hold through the summer storms," he said. She turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said, "for organizing it." "I enjoyed it," he said, and it was true. She looked at him with the careful, weighing expression that he was learning to watch for, and then she said, "You do a great many things for people in this county, Harlan Prescott." "The things that need doing," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you seem to derive something from it, the doing of it." He was quiet for a moment, surprised by the accuracy of it, the way she had cut directly to something he had never articulated even to himself. "I suppose I do," he said. "That is not a character flaw," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It is quite the opposite, but it also means that people here have a different relationship with you than with anyone else. They feel they owe you, you know that." "Yes," he said carefully. "And does that trouble you?" He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "when people act differently around me because of it, when they cannot just be plain with me." She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had been thinking. "I imagine," she said, "that it is unusual to encounter someone who simply pays their way." The sentence dropped between them with the weight of everything it contained, and Harlan stood in the gate of her property in the long gold evening light, and looked at this woman who had come from St. Louis with 1 trunk and 1 horse and a list of practical supplies, who had paid a dead man's debt because the name was hers to carry, who had stood up in a county meeting to protect families she barely knew, who had climbed up on her own roof rather than simply accept help, and who was now, with characteristic directness, saying something to him that no one in Sumner County had come close to saying in 6 years. "It is very unusual," he said. They looked at each other in the gold light for a moment that stretched out longer than it had any practical reason to, and then Dorothy said, "Good evening, Harlan." And there was something different in her voice, warmer and softer than her usual cadence, barely perceptible, the way warmth comes through a very thick wall. He rode home as the first stars appeared and sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. He did not drink and looked at the dark southern sky for a long time, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. June arrived with heat and purpose. The county was humming with the work of early summer, cattle drives and planting, and the perpetual negotiation between what you hoped for and what the land was willing to give you. Harlan was fully occupied with his ranch, the seasonal press of branding and fence riding, and the usual small disasters that required his attention, and he told himself that he was not thinking about Dorothy Bancroft more than was reasonable, which was a self-assessment that Amos clearly found questionable, judging by the way the old man looked at Harlan one morning when Harlan announced he was going to ride the east fence. "East fence again," Amos said. "It needs checking," Harlan said. "You checked it 2 days ago," Amos said. "Things happen to fences," Harlan said, and rode east. Dorothy was in her kitchen garden when he came up the lane, wearing a broad-brimmed hat against the sun and looking at him with an expression that suggested she was neither surprised nor displeased to see him. "The east fence," she said. "Needs checking regularly," he said. She looked at him for a moment with her dark eyes and then said, "I made too much cornbread this morning, if you wanted some." He got down from Cobalt. They sat on her porch in the warm June morning and ate cornbread with plum preserves and drank coffee. And they talked about a range of things that Harlan would later have difficulty reconstructing in any organized order, because the conversation moved the way good conversations do, freely, and without a set destination. She told him about Cincinnati and about her father's conviction that education was the most useful thing you could give anyone. And he told her about coming to Kansas from Virginia at 19 with his older brother Thomas, who had died of fever 3 years later, and whose grave was at the south edge of Harlan's property under a stand of cottonwood. She listened to him talk about Thomas with the specific quality of attention that is different from sympathy, which is full of feeling, and different from polite interest, which is empty of it, and which sits somewhere between the two, clear and present and not trying to fix anything. It made him talk more honestly than he usually did about Thomas, about how much he had relied on his older brother in the first hard years out west, and how Thomas's death had made him feel as though the ground had gone uncertain under his feet for a long time afterward, and how he had worked his way back to something solid by making himself useful to the county around him, not consciously, not as a strategy, but because it was the only way he knew to keep moving. Dorothy was quiet when he finished, looking at the flat land beyond her fence. "Your brother sounds like someone worth mourning," she said. "He was," Harlan said. "And all the things you have done for this county," she said slowly, "they are not about debt, not other people's debt to you. They are about something else entirely." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Thomas died and the ground went uncertain," she said, "and you steadied it by steadying things around you. That is not the action of a man who wants to be owed. That is the action of a man who needs the world to hold still." The accuracy of it was so unexpected and so clean that it took him a moment to respond. "You are very direct," he said finally. "I know," she said without apology. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said, and meant it completely. She looked at him then, and the warmth that he had heard through the thick wall of her composure was more present now, warmer and closer, and he thought she might say something more, but instead she looked down at her coffee cup and said, "I lost Edmund in the winter of '77. "I heard," he said quietly, "typhoid." "Yes, it was fast. He was sick on a Tuesday and gone by Friday." She was quiet for a moment. "We had a decent marriage, a kind one. I want to be honest about that, which means I should also be honest that it was not a great love. And when he was gone and I was deciding what to do with the rest of my life, I thought, I would rather build something that is entirely mine than stay in something comfortable that was not quite right. "So you came to Kansas," Harlan said. "George Bancroft's property was available, and the deed situation was fixable if you read the right documents carefully enough, and the price was within my means. And yes," she said, "I came to Kansas." "And paid George's debt at Dodd's store in exact coin," he said. She smiled at that, the full smile that changed the geometry of her face, and he felt again the unprepared-for warmth of it. "I paid George's debt at Dodd's store in exact coin," she confirmed. He wanted to say something, and he was not sure what or how, and the wanting was unusual because Harlan Prescott was generally a man who knew what he wanted to say and said it. But this was different territory, and he knew it, and he did not want to get it wrong, and the uncertainty was itself a kind of information, a marker of how much it mattered. "Dorothy," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to call on you," he said. "Properly." The deliberate, weighing expression moved across her face, and he watched it with the sustained attention of a man who understands that some things should not be rushed. Then she said, "I think that would be agreeable, Harlan, if you understand that I am not a woman who does things halfway." "I had gathered," he said, "and that I have no interest in arrangements that are not honest and even." "I had gathered that too," she looked at him steadily, "and that I am not in need of rescue." "I know," he said, "that is not what I am offering." She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her expression settled, the way water settles when the current stops pulling at it, and she said, "Then yes, I think that would be very agreeable." He rode home in the blazing June noon with the sun direct overhead, and his shadow almost gone, and the feeling of being very precisely and completely alive, which was not something he had experienced in a long time, and which he had not, until this moment, realized he had been missing. The summer of 1879 moved through its long hot days with the sustained beauty that Kansas produces sometimes, when the rains come right, and the grass is tall, and the sky is the particular deep blue of a good year. And Harlan Prescott rode east every few days, sometimes with a reason and sometimes without one, and Dorothy Bancroft always met him at the gate or on the porch or in the kitchen garden, and they talked about everything, which is the only reliable foundation for anything. He met her neighbors more formally through her, because she had made herself a careful and active part of the community east of town in ways he had not, his own connections being mostly with the ranching families to the south and west. He understood the Cutter family better through her, Samuel Cutter's quiet pride, and his wife Ellen's extraordinary competence, and their 3 children who ran around the yard in organized chaos. He met the widow Margaret Thorne, who had 5 acres and a milk cow, and a determination that reminded him, in a lower register, of Dorothy herself. He helped Margaret repair a fence post one afternoon almost without thinking about it, and Dorothy, riding back from a visit, saw him doing it and stopped her horse and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something more tender. "East fence," she said. "Different fence," he said. "And yet here you are," she said, and smiled and rode on. He was beginning to understand that she was not precisely keeping score. The accounting she maintained was not a coldness but a kind of precision, a desire to know that what was between people was honest and not muddied by obligation. And that desire came from a place in her that was not calculating but deeply, particularly ethical. She wanted to be able to say that she had carried her name clean and paid her way and not owed her happiness to anyone's charity, because only then could she be sure that the happiness was real. He admired this so completely and so specifically that it sometimes startled him. In late July, a problem arose that Harlan handled in his usual way, and that brought the whole thing to a kind of crisis neither of them had quite anticipated. A man named Vernon Peel arrived in Caldwell, claiming to hold a promissory note from the estate of George Bancroft, a document asserting that George owed Peel $112 for unspecified services rendered, and that the note transferred with the property to the new owner, which meant Dorothy owed Vernon Peel $112, or he had the right to put a lien on the property. Dorothy received notice of this through Otis Webb at the county clerk's office, who had the grace to look personally outraged when he handed her the document. She came home, read it 3 times, and then sat at her small writing desk and began composing a careful letter to the county courthouse in Wellington, because she had read enough of the applicable statutes to believe that a promissory note of this nature, unsigned by any witnessed party other than Peel himself, and purporting to bind a property that was in active deed dispute at the time of the alleged debt, was not legally enforceable under Kansas law as she understood it. She was right. She was entirely right. But the legal correspondence would take weeks, and in the meantime Vernon Peel was in Caldwell making noise, and he was not a pleasant man. He was large and loud and had 2 companions who stood behind him in the manner of men who are paid to stand behind people, and he had taken to appearing outside the general store and telling anyone who would listen that Dorothy Bancroft was a woman trying to cheat an honest creditor. Harlan heard this on a Tuesday morning and rode into town that afternoon. He did not do anything dramatic. He did not threaten Peel or make a scene. He simply had a conversation with him, standing outside the general store in the clear afternoon light, and the conversation was quiet and thorough and specific, and it covered the relevant Kansas statutes that Dorothy had already identified, and it also covered Harlan's own direct knowledge that George Bancroft had never mentioned a Vernon Peel in any conversation Harlan had had with him over the years, which were many. And it also covered the fact that Harlan knew every judge in Wellington personally, through long-standing professional acquaintance, and that a fraudulent promissory note was a criminal matter, not a civil one. Vernon Peel left Caldwell the following morning. Dorothy heard about this from Frank Dodds, who had witnessed the conversation, on Wednesday. She stood in the store for a moment after Frank finished telling her, her expression doing something careful and complex, and then she went home and sat at her writing desk and continued the letter to Wellington anyway, because the legal situation was still unresolved in principle, even if Peel had departed in practice, and because she intended to resolve it properly and not simply let it hang. She also, that same evening, rode to Harlan's property for the first time. Harlan was on his porch when she came up the lane, and he was clearly surprised to see her, which was gratifying in a small way she did not fully examine. She got down from her horse and stood at the foot of his porch steps and looked at him. "Frank told me about Peel," she said. "Frank tells everyone things," Harlan said. "He does," she agreed. "Harlan, Dorothy." She looked at him with her direct, dark eyes and said, "I had already identified the relevant statutes. I was writing the letter to Wellington. I was handling it." "I know," he said, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "I did not do it because you needed rescuing." "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the warm evening light on his porch. "Because he was saying things about you publicly that were not true, and I was not willing to stand by and hear that," he said. "Not as a favor, not as a debt, because it mattered to me personally that it stopped." She looked at him for a long time. The evening was warm, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek were doing their slow summer sway in the light wind, and Harlan Prescott stood on his own porch in the evening and watched Dorothy Bancroft decide something. "That," she said finally, "is a different thing." "Yes," he said. "Sit down," she said, and came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, and they sat together in the warm July evening talking until the stars were thick and the air had gone cool, and the prairie around them was full of its night sounds, the crickets and the creek and the occasional distant call of something large and moving in the dark grassland. He walked her to her horse when she finally rose to go, and they stood at the gate in the starlight, and Harlan was aware with particular clarity of the distance between them, a few feet of dark air that felt charged with possibility, and of the specific discipline it took not to close it without knowing it was right. "I think," Dorothy said carefully, looking up at him, "that I am becoming quite fond of you, Harlan." The restraint in the sentence was characteristic of her, the quite, the becoming, the careful accounting of where she actually was rather than where she might like to be, and he loved her for it with a completeness that surprised him entirely. "I think I am considerably past fond," he said. She looked at him, and the warmth was fully through the wall now, present and clear and warm in her face in the starlight, and she said, "Then perhaps you ought to do something about that." He kissed her there at the gate of his property in the starlight of a July night in 1879, and it was the specific kind of kiss that has nothing tentative about it, the kind that comes from two people who have been thinking about it long enough to know exactly what they want. And she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, clear and honest and unguarded. And when they separated, she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "Yes," which was entirely sufficient. August was entirely different from everything that had come before it. Harlan began calling on Dorothy formally, which in the practical terms of their situation meant riding east with specific purpose, and staying for meals, and sitting on her porch long into the evenings, and talking the way they had been talking, but now with the addition of a warmth between them that changed everything's quality, the way cream changes coffee. He brought her things when he had reason to bring them. A copy of a territorial land survey she had asked Otis Webb about that Harlan had found at the library in Wellington. 2 pounds of good coffee from the supply order he had put in with the merchant there. A volume of essays he thought she would like, and which she read in 3 days and returned with a dozen opinions about. She brought him preserves and cornbread, and, one evening, a jar of the wild plum preserves that he had already declared superior to anything made in civilization. He met her brothers, in the sense of reading their letters, because she showed him 2 of them in August after he had asked about her family, and they were very much what she had described, warm and slightly worried and entirely devoted to their sister. The middle one, whose name was Charles, had apparently been urging her for the past several months to come back to St. Louis, with a particular intensity in the most recent letter that made Dorothy look at it with mild exasperation. "He thinks I am out here alone," she said. "You were," Harlan said. "I was managing," she said, which was true. Then she looked at him with the careful directness that he had come to cherish. "I suppose I should write him that circumstances have changed somewhat." "Somewhat," Harlan said, smiling. She looked at him for a moment, and then something shy moved across her face, unexpectedly, because she was not a shy person, and the glimpse of it was endearing in a way that made his chest ache. "He will want to know what circumstances," she said. "Then tell him," Harlan said. "And what exactly should I say?" He looked at her in the August afternoon heat on her porch, the flat land spreading away to the east, the repaired roof solid above them, the kitchen garden full and productive in the sun, and the whole 40 acres of her property speaking in its own language of what she had built here through her own will and intelligence and steady work. And he thought about a woman who came west with a trunk and a horse and a list, and paid a dead man's debt because the name was hers to carry. And he thought about how entirely unprepared he had been for the specific weight and clarity of her, and he said, "Tell him that you have met a man who finds your habit of counting everything in exact coin to be one of the finer things he has ever encountered in his life." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very softly, "Harlan." "And tell him," he said, "that the man in question would very much like to ask you something if you were willing to hear it." She was very still. "I know you do not want rescue," he said. "I know you built this place yourself, and you are keeping the name clean, and you have no need of anyone to manage your life for you, and I am not asking to. I am asking something different." He paused. "I would like to be part of your life, not instead of what you have built, but alongside it, and I would like you to be part of mine, alongside it." He looked at her steadily. "I am not a man who is good at speeches, but I am a man who means what he says. And what I am saying is that I love you, Dorothy Bancroft, and I would like you to marry me if you are willing." The moment held. The heat pressed down on the August afternoon. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the direction of the creek. Dorothy sat in her chair on her porch and looked at Harlan Prescott with her dark eyes and did the thing she always did, the careful weighing, the honest accounting, and he waited because he understood her well enough now to know that what she was doing was not hesitating from doubt, but rather making sure she was saying what was true. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to, or at least I did not expect to this quickly, but I find that I do not know how to be approximate about it, so I will say it plainly. I love you, Harlan." She took a breath. "And yes, I will marry you." He crossed the porch in 3 steps and took her hands, and she stood up, and he looked at her face in the August afternoon light, flushed and honest and entirely itself. And he thought that the whole county owed him things he had never wanted repaid. And this woman, this particular woman, had walked into Frank Dodd's store and counted $37.60 in exact coin for a debt that was not technically hers, and had changed everything. And he did not fully know what to do with that enormity, except to hold her hands in his and feel the warm weight of it and be grateful. They were married in October of 1879, in the Caldwell church, on a clear cold day when the sky was the pale blue of late autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow gold. The church was full, which was not surprising, because half the county had a reason to wish Harlan Prescott well, and the other half had come to know Dorothy Bancroft in the months she had lived east of town, and the combination meant that Frank Dodd's had to drag in extra benches from the hall, and people still stood along the walls. Dorothy wore a deep blue dress she had made herself over the course of September, which was exactly the right blue for her dark eyes and her dark hair, and she walked down the aisle on the arm of Otis Webb, who had asked, with profound formality, if he might have the honor, on account of her brothers being too far away to come in time, and on account of his feeling that her methodical and thorough approach to county legal documents had done as much good for the community as anything he could think of. She had accepted with the composed grace she brought to everything. Harlan watched her come down that aisle and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 6 years, since Thomas died and the ground went uncertain, a final tectonic resolution, the world coming right under his feet. He said his vows in the plain, steady voice that was his natural voice, and she said hers in her clear, unhurried Missouri voice. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel Cutter began to clap, and the whole church followed, and the sound of it went up into the rafters and out through the open church doors into the cold October air over Caldwell, Kansas. At the reception in the church hall, Amos Tate shook Dorothy's hand with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this and is deeply satisfied, and Billy Crane told her she was the finest cook in Sumner County and possibly the state, and Commissioner Garrett congratulated them both with a heartiness that held a slight unease under it, which Dorothy noticed and found privately amusing. Frank Dodd's made a toast that was longer than it needed to be and contained more story than was strictly appropriate, and was entirely affectionate, and several people cried, and Dorothy did not cry, but she came very close twice, which Harlan could see because he had learned her face well enough by October to read its finest gradations. She moved her belongings to his ranch at the end of October, which meant moving 1 trunk, 2 boxes of books, a writing desk she was very particular about, a jar of plum preserves she was currently in the process of making, and the 2 chickens she was most attached to, who had names that Harlan did not ask about because he suspected the answer would be complicated. They merged their lives with the same deliberateness and honesty they had brought to everything between them. She took over the kitchen with a calm authority that Amos found entirely wonderful, and Billy found somewhat daunting. She organized the accounts which had been kept in Harlan's characteristic method of rough notes and approximate memory, into a ledger so precise and clear that Harlan looked at it with something between admiration and mild shame. "This is how you see the world," he said, looking at the ledger. "It is how I think clearly," she said. "Does it trouble you?" "Not at all," he said. "I am just seeing it laid out in a way I never did before." She looked at him over the top of the ledger. "You have been very successful without it," she said, "but now you will be even better organized." He laughed, which was something he found himself doing considerably more frequently in the month of November than he had in the previous 6 years. And Dorothy looked at him with the warm, unguarded expression that she now showed him freely, the one that he had first seen through the thick wall of her composure, and which he had learned was not less genuine for having been carefully guarded, but rather more so. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a hard one by Kansas standards, cold and long and pressing, with storms that kept people close to their fire and their families in ways that were sometimes clarifying. Harlan and Dorothy weathered it in the ranch house that felt entirely different now, warmer and more alive, full of her books and her letters to her brothers and her preserves in orderly rows in the root cellar, and the 2 chickens that wintered in the barn, and whose names he had finally learned, were Prudence and Capital, which made him laugh so hard she had looked at him with fond exasperation. He told her about everything that winter, the way you tell someone everything when you have finally found the person you can tell. He told her about the Doyle gang, the real version, which was more frightening than the legend, a long, ugly chase across the flats in the August heat that had come much closer to going wrong than he had ever admitted to anyone. He told her about the debt he had felt to Thomas, the older brother who had brought him west and taught him everything about the land and had died before he could see what Harlan made of it. He told her about the loneliness that had settled into the years after Thomas like water into a hollow, not dramatic, not crushing, just present and cold and seemingly permanent. She listened with her particular quality of clear, present attention, and when he was done she said, "Thomas would have liked the ranch very much." "He would have liked you more," Harlan said. She smiled. "I would have liked him. He sounds like someone who knew what was important." "He did," Harlan said, "better than me at the same age." "You knew what was important," she said. "You just expressed it by riding after cattle thieves and paying doctor bills." "And you expressed it by paying $37.60 in exact coin," he said. "Exactly," she said. "We are, it turns out, quite similar people." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the table between them, and she turned it palm up and held his. And the fire was warm, and the winter was outside the walls, and they sat in the good quiet of 2 people who have found what they were looking for and know it. Spring came early in 1880, a merciful March that melted the last snow and pushed green through the brown prairie grass with an urgency that felt personal. And with spring came Dorothy's brother Charles, who had finally made good on his letter threats and come from St. Louis to see for himself whether his sister was truly all right, which he phrased as a casual visit, and which everyone understood was an inspection. He arrived on a Tuesday by the stage from Wichita, a tall, thin man in his late 20s with Dorothy's dark eyes and a somewhat more anxious version of her directness, and he shook Harlan's hand on the porch of the ranch house with the grip of a man who is making an assessment. "Mr. Prescott," he said. "Charles," Harlan said. "Call me Harlan." Charles looked at him for a moment and then looked at his sister and said, "You look well." "I am well," she said. "You look more than well," he said, with the specific tone of an older sibling who has been relieved of a significant worry. He stayed for a week, and by Thursday had abandoned any pretense of inspection in favor of genuine pleasure in the company, helping Harlan with fence repairs, and asking him long, detailed questions about Kansas water law that Harlan answered partly from his own knowledge, and partly by referring him to Dorothy, who answered them with the precision of someone who had read every relevant document the county clerk's office possessed. The evening before Charles left, after dinner, he sat on the porch with Harlan while Dorothy was inside writing a letter, and he said, without preamble, "She wrote me about you when things were beginning. She said you were a man who did things for people who needed doing for, and that you did not seem to want anything in return." "That is accurate," Harlan said. "She also said," Charles continued carefully, "that she was not sure what to do with a man like that, because she has always known exactly how to manage a transaction, and you seem to be a different kind of thing entirely." Harlan was quiet, looking at the spring evening over the south pasture. She said, Charles went on, that you made her want to find a way to pay her way with you, and she did not know what currency to use. Harlan turned to look at him. What did you tell her? I told her that perhaps the currency was the same, Charles said. That perhaps the thing she could give you was the same thing she asked of you. Honesty, presence, choosing it clearly and not from obligation. He looked at Harlan steadily. Was I right? Yes, Harlan said. Exactly right. Charles nodded with the satisfied expression of a man who has seen what he came to see. She has never in her life owed anyone anything she did not repay, he said. She has been like that since she was 12 years old. Our father said it was a quality that would either make her extraordinary or wear her out entirely. And, Harlan said. Charles smiled, looking at his sister through the window where she sat at her desk in the lamplight, writing. I think it is making her extraordinary, he said, with the appropriate company. He left the next morning and hugged Dorothy with a roughness that she returned with the warmth she showed only to the people she trusted most, and shook Harlan's hand again, this time without the assessment, just the handshake of one man to another. The spring of 1880 moved into summer with the full-throated confidence of a good year. Dorothy's 40 acres, now managed in conjunction with Harlan's ranch, flourished in the ways that careful attention produces, her kitchen garden expanding, her corn crop planted in the south field of her parcel with the help of Amos and Billy and Harlan, on a bright May morning that became one of those memories of sheer physical pleasure. The turned earth and the clean sky, and the four of them working together with the easy rhythm of people who have found their arrangement. She told him in June that she was expecting a child. She told him in her characteristic way, plainly and directly, looking at him from across the breakfast table on a June morning with the early light coming through the kitchen window. And he put down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something move through him that had no precedent in his experience, something so large and warm and complicated that he sat very still with it for a moment, which made her look at him with a slightly uncertain expression that he was not used to seeing on her face. Harlan, she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in his hands with the particular care you use with something extraordinary, and he kissed her forehead and said, Dorothy, and could not immediately say anything more, which made her laugh, which was the sound he had come to love most in the world, clear and genuine and bright as water. You are pleased, she said. I do not have a word for what I am, he said. Inarticulate, she suggested. Yes, he said, still holding her face. Profoundly inarticulate. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. Good, she said softly. I find I am as well. In November of 1880, their son was born, a large, healthy boy who arrived in the world with impressive determination and a voice to match, and whom they named Thomas James Prescott, Thomas for Harlan's brother and James for Dorothy's father. The birth was attended by the county midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Adler, and by Harlan, who was present because Dorothy had told him she wanted him there, and because it had not occurred to him to be anywhere else. He held her hand through the long, hard hours of it and talked to her about anything she wanted to hear, the creek running high from the October rains, the cattle through the summer, the letter Charles had sent about his forthcoming wedding to a woman named Agnes, whose description in the letter had made Dorothy say Charles was clearly very happy. And Harlan talked about all of it in his steady voice, until Thomas James Prescott arrived in the early hours of the morning with that extraordinary voice and that clear insistence on being present. Harlan held his son with the careful gravity of a man holding something that has reorganized the entire structure of his life, which is precisely what had happened. And he looked down at the small red face of Thomas James Prescott and thought about his brother Thomas in the south field under the cottonwoods, and felt that the world had, in some particular and unmeasurable way, come right. Dorothy, exhausted and clear-eyed in the lamplight of the bedroom, watched her husband hold their son and said, He has your jaw. I hope he has your sense, Harlan said. He will have both, she said, with the confidence of a woman who intends to see to it. The winter of 1880 and into 1881 was spent in the full and particular richness of a family newly made, the specific chaos and warmth of a baby in a household that had previously run on the organized efficiency of two careful adults, and was now reorganized around the absolute priority of Thomas James Prescott, who turned out to have opinions about most things and no hesitation about expressing them. Dorothy managed this reorganization with the same practicality she brought to everything, reading what she could find about child-rearing with the same thoroughness she brought to county ordinances, adapting what was useful and discarding what was not, nursing Thomas and sleeping when she could, and talking to him in her clear Missouri voice about anything that came to mind, which included occasionally the relevant sections of the Kansas Territorial Code. Harlan, who had spent a significant portion of his adult life doing things for other people's families, found that doing things for his own family operated on an entirely different frequency, louder and more particular and more demanding in ways that were entirely welcome. He did not sleep enough. He learned that Thomas James Prescott was most likely to settle in the evenings when held in a certain position, and walked in a slow circuit of the kitchen, which he did for long stretches of winter evening while Dorothy slept, and the fire burned low, and the prairie outside was quiet under its snow. In the spring of 1881, the water rights ordinance that Commissioner Garrett had been trying to push through for 2 years finally came to a vote in the revised form that Dorothy's intervention at the 1879 meeting had helped produce. The revision protected the smaller parcels with recording gaps, and it passed without significant opposition. Otis Webb wrote Dorothy a brief formal note saying that her actions in 1879 had materially affected the outcome for 14 property owners in Sumner County, which was the kind of precise accounting she appreciated. Harlan read the note and looked at his wife across the kitchen table and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. She looked back at him and said, 14. Exactly 14, he said. I like having the number, she said. I know, he said. By the summer of 1881, life at the Prescott Ranch had settled into a rhythm that was both busy and deeply satisfying, the good rhythm of a life built on a solid foundation and maintained by two people who were genuinely suited to each other. Amos Tate continued in his role of doing everything necessary with minimal discussion, and had become, in the year since Dorothy arrived, quietly devoted to her in the manner of a man who recognizes quality and is grateful to be in proximity to it. Billy Crane had left the previous year to try his luck in Colorado, where a cousin was operating a small horse ranch, and his departure had been marked by Dorothy providing him with enough preserved food for the journey that he had looked at her with undisguised emotion and thanked her with the gravity of someone receiving something important. A new hand, a young man of 20 named Jesse Portman, from a farming family south of Caldwell, had taken Billy's place. He was steady and willing and a little overwhelmed by Dorothy in the first few weeks, the way people sometimes were when they encountered someone who was simultaneously warm and precise, and Harlan watched him find his footing around her with the private amusement of a man who remembered being similarly recalibrated. Dorothy's 40 acres were formally integrated into the ranch's operations by mid-1881, not in the sense of losing their separate identity, but in the practical sense of being managed as part of a coherent whole, which produced efficiencies and possibilities that neither piece alone had offered. The south field of her parcel, which she had planted in corn in 1880, was expanded and produced a yield that supplemented the ranch income in ways that Harlan's strictly cattle-focused approach had not previously allowed. Dorothy's accounts, maintained with their characteristic precision, showed the ranch operating at a substantially improved margin by the end of 1881. Harlan showed the ledger to Amos one autumn evening and said, "She made us considerably better organized." Amos looked at the ledger with his methodical appreciation. "She made us considerably better," he said simply, which was a distinction Harlan recognized as entirely accurate. Thomas James Prescott turned 1 year old in November of 1881, with the full celebration that his character seemed to demand, which Dorothy organized with efficiency, and Harlan supplemented with the joy of a man who has found that celebrating things comes more naturally when you have the right person to celebrate with. Charles and his new wife Agnes sent a letter and a gift from St. Louis. Agnes, based on the letter, was everything Charles's earlier description had suggested: warm and spirited, and apparently willing to stand up to Charles's anxiety in ways that Dorothy found entirely appropriate, and which Harlan, based on the letter, was prepared to like her for. The letter also mentioned that Agnes was expecting a child in the spring, which made Dorothy write back with the kind of thorough and practical advice about confinement and preparation that was entirely characteristic of her, and which Agnes apparently found both useful and entertaining, based on her responding letter, which arrived in January of 1882, and was, by far, the most engaging letter Harlan had seen Dorothy receive. Winter evenings in the ranch house in 1882 had the quality of something right, a word Harlan found himself returning to in private moments of assessment. Thomas played on the kitchen floor with increasing mobility and determination. Dorothy read or wrote at her desk or sat near the fire with her mending, and she and Harlan talked in the long, ranging way they had been talking since that spring evening on the road from the church meeting, about everything and nothing, about the county and the country and the particular challenges and pleasures of the life they had built. He told her once, in February of 1882, that he had never imagined marrying someone who made him feel, specifically, better understood. She looked at him from her chair by the fire with Thomas sleeping on her lap, and she said, "I never imagined marrying someone who made me feel, specifically, at ease." He looked at her. "You seemed very at ease when I met you." "No," she said. "I seemed competent. There is a difference. I was not at ease. I was managing. I did not know what at ease felt like as a regular condition until you." He crossed the room and sat beside her and kissed her carefully because of Thomas asleep between them, and she smiled against his mouth and touched his face with her free hand. By spring of 1882, Dorothy was expecting their second child, which she announced with the same directness she had brought to the first announcement, across the breakfast table in the April morning, and Harlan put down his coffee cup again, which made her laugh again, and he said, "You would think I would be more prepared the second time," and she said, "I would think so too," and they smiled at each other across the table with Thomas in his chair between them eating biscuit with extraordinary focus. The summer was good and full and busy. Thomas began walking in earnest in June, and the logistics of life at the ranch reorganized themselves around this development. Dorothy managed it with her characteristic practical grace, setting up a system of gates and barriers that Harlan built to her specifications, which were precise and clear, as her specifications always were. The second child, a girl, arrived in November of 1882 during a hard windstorm that kept everyone close to the house and filled the night with the sound of the prairie pressing against the walls. She arrived faster than Thomas had, in the early evening with the lamp lit and the fire high and Mrs. Adler presiding with her comfortable efficiency. They named her Clara Ann Prescott, Clara for the woman Harlan had been engaged to years ago, which Dorothy had suggested herself, saying that it seemed right to name a daughter for someone kind, and Anne for Dorothy's mother, who had died when Dorothy was 15 and whom she had missed every day since in the quiet, permanent way you miss someone who was the center of something important. Clara Ann Prescott was small and dark-haired and serene in a way that Thomas was not, and she regarded the world from her first days with a steady, observational calm that Harlan, looking at his daughter, recognized with profound familiarity as her mother's quality in new and extraordinary form. "She has your eyes," he said to Dorothy. "And your patience," Dorothy said, watching their daughter sleep. "I do not think patience is genetic," Harlan said. "No," Dorothy agreed, "but it can be modeled. She looked up at him with the warm, direct expression he loved most. "She will have excellent models." The years that followed had the quality of something earned and tended, not easy, because the life was not easy. Kansas was not easy, and ranching was not easy, and raising children on the frontier in the 1880s was a sustained and serious undertaking, but deeply, specifically right. Harlan continued to be the man the county turned to in difficulty, not because he sought it, but because he was capable and present, and Dorothy continued to be the person who paid her way and kept her accounts clean, and used that same precision to do considerable good in the ways available to her. The Water Rights Ordinance, the letter writing that helped 3 separate families through deed and property disputes in the 1882 and 1883 seasons. The careful organization of a county relief fund in 1884 when a late frost killed a significant portion of the county's crops and left several families in serious need. The relief fund was Dorothy's project from beginning to end. She organized it, administered it, kept its accounts with the ledger precision that by now everyone in the county knew to expect from her, and distributed its resources in the methodical, equitable way that left people with their dignity intact. It raised $314, which was more than Harlan had expected and entirely what Dorothy had calculated. She showed him the final accounting one October evening, the fund fully distributed, and the ledger balanced to zero. $314, he said. Exactly, she said. You always get the exact number, he said. It is the only honest way, she said, and looked at him with her dark eyes warm in the lamplight. And he thought, as he had thought many times in the past several years, that the whole county owed him a debt he had never wanted paid, and this woman had walked in and paid her way, and in doing so had given him the thing he had not known to ask for, which was the particular luxury of being understood clearly and loved plainly by someone who counted everything in exact coin and had counted him, in her own particular accounting, as worth everything. Thomas was 4 and Clara was 2, and the house was alive with the noise and motion of children who were becoming themselves. Thomas with his strong opinions and his father's jaw, and a growing inclination toward practical action that made Amos smile, and Clara with her mother's serious eyes and an already evident precision in the way she approached the world, fitting pieces together and observing the results with the patient attention of someone who is learning how things work and will not stop until she understands. On an evening in the late fall of 1884, Harlan and Dorothy sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the cold, clear night with the stars thick overhead and the prairie dark and quiet around the lights of the house, and Dorothy leaned against his shoulder the way she had learned to do in the years of their marriage, the ease she had said she had not known before him, fully present and fully herself. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning we met in Frank Dodd's store?" "I remember putting my hat on and taking it off again," he said. She laughed softly. "You looked very uncertain." "I was uncertain," he said. "You looked directly at me and I had no preparation for it. And now?" She said. He looked at her profile against the star-thick sky, at the woman who had come to Kansas with a trunk and a horse and a list, and who had reorganized his life as thoroughly as she reorganized the ranch accounts, and who had given him Thomas and Clara, and 5 years of the kind of partnership that he now understood was the rarest thing in the world. "Now," he said, "I think I have finally learned the currency." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes clear and warm. "What currency is that?" "The same one you have always used," he said. "Honesty, presence, choosing it every day and not from obligation." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned her face into his shoulder and said nothing, which was the way Dorothy Bancroft expressed things that were too large for her characteristic precision, and he held her in the cold prairie night under the thick Kansas stars and felt the ground entirely solid under his feet. In the spring of 1885, Charles and Agnes came from St. Louis for a visit, bringing their 2-year-old daughter and the news that another child was on the way, And the house was loud and full for 2 weeks with the particular richness of a family gathered, the children playing and the adults talking and the table full every evening. Agnes turned out to be exactly as the letters had suggested, warm and spirited, with a humor that complemented Charles's anxiety beautifully. And she and Dorothy spent long mornings in the kitchen talking with the ease of two women who have found they suit each other, which Dorothy later told Harlan was one of the most pleasant surprises of the year. Charles, watching his sister move through her house and her life and her marriage, said to Harlan on the last evening on the porch with the spring air mild and the creek running full below the south field, "She is happy." "I know," Harlan said. "I mean genuinely, completely happy," Charles said. "Not managing, not maintaining, happy." "Yes," Harlan said. "That is what I needed to see," Charles said simply, and they sat for a while in the comfortable silence of men who do not need to elaborate. By the summer of 1885, the ranch was in its finest condition in its history. The combined management of Harlan's instinct and experience and Dorothy's precise accounting producing a prosperity that was modest by Eastern standards and substantial by the standards of Sumner County in the 1880s. Jesse Portman had grown into an excellent hand and had hired on permanently, with the quiet pride of a young man who has found his place. Amos Tate, older now and slower in the mornings but still methodical and entirely reliable, showed no interest in retirement, and Dorothy showed no interest in suggesting it, and the arrangement continued happily. Thomas started school in the fall of 1885 at the Caldwell schoolhouse, walking the 1.25 miles with Jesse on mornings when Harlan was occupied with the cattle, and coming home in the afternoons full of everything, questions about words and numbers and the way things worked. And Dorothy answered him with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, sitting at the kitchen table with him and going through his lessons with a care that the schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Ellery, who was also relatively new to Caldwell, recognized and appreciated. Miss Ellery told Dorothy one afternoon when Dorothy came to collect Thomas that Thomas was the most prepared student she had taught, which Dorothy received with the composed grace she always used for compliments, and which Harlan, when she told him in the evening, received with a smile so large that she looked at him with fond exasperation and said, "Do not be insufferable about it." "I am not being insufferable," he said. "I am being proud." "They are sometimes the same thing," she said and smiled. Clara, at 2 years old and growing toward 3, was already showing signs of the same appetite for information as her brother, though her method was quieter and more observational, and she had a way of appearing next to adults in the middle of conversations and listening with the focused attention of someone taking notes, which Harlan found simultaneously charming and slightly unnerving, because the precision of it was very familiar. In the autumn of 1885, Harlan came home from riding the south pasture one October afternoon to find Dorothy at her writing desk with a letter in front of her, and an expression that was doing the careful, complex thing it did when she was working through something significant. He hung his coat and hat and came to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the desk without asking, because he had learned her well enough to know when coffee was what the moment required, and she looked up and took the cup with the brief, warm look that was her equivalent of a long speech of gratitude. "The Cutter farm," she said. He sat down across from her. "What about it?" "Samuel Cutter died last month." "I did not know. The letter is from Ellen. She is trying to hold the farm together, but the note on the property is coming due in February, and she has 3 children, and the harvest was short this year, and she does not know what to do." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Dorothy looked at him. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "Do you?" "You are thinking about what needs doing," she said, with the quiet warmth that she used when she was being entirely certain of him. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about it too," she said. "We have the surplus from this year's harvest. Not all of it, but enough, together with what the relief fund carried over from last year, to cover the note, if we approach it correctly." He looked at her across the table. She was looking at the letter with her precise, careful eyes, and he thought about all of the specific and careful ways she had carried the name clean and paid the way and kept the accounts honest. And here she was again, looking at a neighbor's trouble and thinking about what needed doing in exact coin. "Together," he said. She looked up. "Yes," she said, "together. It is both our names on the account now." He held out his hand across the table, and she put hers in it, and they sat in the late October afternoon in their kitchen with the children's sounds from the other room, and the fire beginning to warm and the accounts clean and the land around them dark and good and theirs. They helped Ellen Cutter through the winter, quietly and specifically, the way Harlan had always done things, without fanfare and without expectation of return. Dorothy organized the arrangement with her characteristic precision, the amounts documented, the terms clear and fair, the note paid by February as planned. Ellen Cutter, who had known Dorothy for 6 years by this point and knew her well enough to accept the help without embarrassment, because it was offered cleanly, as a straightforward transaction between neighbors, thanked them both at the end of winter with a steadiness that had its own dignity in it, and they accepted the thanks and went on. By the spring of 1886, the Prescott Ranch was a fixed point in the landscape of Sumner County, not just physically but in the way that some households become landmarks of community life, places that people orient around. The county had changed considerably since Harlan had first ridden in from Virginia in 1867, the frontier pressing steadily westward, the towns growing, the telegraph coming through in 1872 and the railroad pushing closer every year, and with it the particular pressure of a changing world on the specific life they had built. Harlan and Dorothy talked about this sometimes in the evenings, the changes and what they meant, the injustices that persisted even as the formal frontier receded, the freed people who had come to Kansas in the 1870s as exodusters and who were still fighting for the same basic dignities the land had promised. The communities south of Caldwell that were organized and hardworking and prosperous in small ways, and yet still subject to treatment that Dorothy documented in letters to the county commissioner with characteristic precision, and Harlan backed in practical terms when occasions arose. This was not dramatic or heroic. It was the ongoing work of people who believed that the name you carried should be clean, that what you owed you paid, and that the things that needed doing in your community were yours to do if you were capable. Their third child was born in June of 1886, a son they named James Samuel Prescott, James again for Dorothy's father and Samuel for Samuel Cutter, which Ellen Cutter, when she heard the name, received with the quiet emotion of someone understanding they have been honored. James arrived in the summer heat with the same determined force that characterized his brother Thomas, though he proved in the first months to have a more sociable temperament than either of his siblings, a ready smile and an inclination toward other people that Harlan recognized, with private amusement, as something he understood well. "He is going to be the one people ask for things," Harlan said one evening, watching James regard the world from Dorothy's arms with that open, interested expression. "Is that a problem?" Dorothy said. "Not at all," Harlan said, "as long as he also knows how to count it out in exact coin." She looked at him with her dark eyes and the warmth that was fully present always now, clear and unguarded and entirely hers. "I will see to that personally," she said. He believed her entirely. In the fall of 1886, Frank Dodds retired from the general store and sold it to a younger man from Wichita. And at the retirement dinner organized by the community, Frank made another speech that was longer than necessary and contained more story than appropriate and was entirely affectionate. And this time it was specifically and at length about Dorothy Bancroft Prescott, and the morning she had walked into his store and counted out $37.60 in exact coin for a debt she had not been required to pay, and what that had meant to him, and what it had come to mean to the county more broadly. Dorothy sat at the table and listened with her composed grace, And when Frank finished and the room looked at her, she said simply, "A debt is a debt. You pay what you owe." Harlan, sitting beside her, took her hand under the table. She turned to look at him in the warm light of the dinner hall, the same clear, dark-eyed gaze she had leveled at him in the general store that April morning 7 years ago. And in it now was everything that 7 years had built. The roof repair and the water rights meeting and the July conversation about Vernon Peel and the October proposal in the August heat, which he had always pointed out, was factually an August proposal. And the wedding and Thomas and Clara and James and the winter evenings and the spring mornings and the long good days of a life built honestly and tended carefully. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back in exact measure which was entirely her, and he smiled and she smiled. And in the warm light of the Caldwell dinner hall in the fall of 1886 they were, finally and fully and completely, exactly where they were supposed to be. The stars that night over the Prescott ranch were thick and cold, and the prairie was wide and dark and quiet. And in the house the children slept and the fire burned low, and the ledger sat on the desk with its columns balanced, and its accounts clean. And outside the cottonwoods along the South Creek moved in the autumn wind over the grave of a man named Thomas who had brought his younger brother west and taught him everything about what mattered and had not lived to see what his brother made of it. But the whole county knew, and the woman who had come from St. Louis with a trunk and a horse and a list knew. And Harlan Prescott, sitting on his porch in the cold autumn starlight with his wife's hand warm in his, knew it too, finally and completely, without a single debt outstanding, without a single thing unresolved, the name clean and the accounts honest and the world holding perfectly still under his feet.